Now, chapter 13, I think gets very interesting. Tell you what, chapter 13, could somebody actually, you're next. Actually, do we have you read already?
No.
Okay, why don't you read verses 1 through 3 for us? And then Stephanie, could you read 4 through 7 right after him?
1, 3.
13, 1 through 3.
Let every soul be subject unto the higher powers, for there is no power but of God. The power that be are ordained of God. Whosoever therefore resisted the power, resisted the utterances of God. And they that receive shall receive to themselves damnation. For rulers are not a terror to good works, but to the evil. Without them not be afraid of the power. Do that which is good, and thou shalt have praise of the same.
For he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. Therefore one must be in subjection, not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. For because of this you also pay taxes, for the authorities are ministers of God attending to this very thing. Pay to all what is owed to them, taxes to whom taxes are owed, revenue to whom revenue is owed, respect to whom respect is owed, honor to whom honor is owed.
Okay? Question for you. Paul's obviously talking about obeying government. Why? What are the reasons?
God put them in place.
God put them in place. That's number one. What else?
It goes to being at peace with all men.
It goes, I agree with that. And that's actually the other portion is, look, basically what Paul's saying is, don't stick a fork in the government or something like that and try to get them all ticked off at you if your purpose is the gospel. Okay? So basically in that respect, he's saying, don't do that kind of stuff, okay? Now, that brings up a lot of questions. Because frankly, one of the things you would say is, well, doesn't that mean that Martin Luther King and the peaceful demonstrations that he did were wrong? Because after all, didn't Paul say to obey the government? Didn't he say no matter what? So we're going to have to start digging into some, I use that as an example because it's a good example in our country. Frankly, also, you've got to start questioning things like, well, what about Operation Rescue? With the abortion issue and things like that. I can tell you this, in Operation Rescue, right or wrong, I know of a case or two where they had sit-ins and people say, oh, what's the sit-in do? They just come back in later, okay? I know of a case or two where a book that my dad did was handed to women that were walking in to have abortions. They read the little booklet, the cartoon booklet, and actually in one case came and met my dad and put the baby in his arms and said, the only reason that baby's here today is because of that booklet and because somebody was blocking the entrance to the abortion clinic. Okay? So now the question becomes though is, just because something has a good ending, does that mean it was a good thing to do? Was it a valid legal thing to do? Okay? Now, the reason I'm bringing this up is to get us thinking about it because frankly there's a lot of different issues we need to think about in this. Number one, before we start going too deep, does anybody remember what the government was like at the time that Paul wrote Romans, and does that have any bearing possibly on what we're looking at? Anybody remember back to the first class we talked about this?
Is this in Nero's good era or bad era?
That's what I'm asking you.
It was not a bad era.
Good era.
It was called the Golden Age of Rome. And it was from about 54 AD to about 60 AD, 59, 60 AD. This book was written in 57 or 58 AD. So at the point in time when this happened, Nero was throwing out governors and actually in some cases even having them executed who were stealing from the people, who were corrupt governors and rulers. Nero was straightening out the tax system so that tax was coming in, but it wasn't an overly burdensome tax and everything. This was at a point in time when Nero was actually, at that time, the best ruler that Rome had ever seen, period. Okay? I'm not saying that necessarily impacts our decision on what these verses say, but we do have to keep the context in mind. Because frankly, when we look at these verses, what we're going to see is Rome was actually a good government for that short period of time. Now you've also got Christ talking about give unto Caesar what Caesar and stuff, but that was twofold. Number one, just addressing taxes primarily, And number two, it was really him answering a specific question by the Pharisees at that point in time. It wasn't supposed to be a comprehensive doctrine necessarily. This is laying it out a little bit more for what we're supposed to be doing with the government. So at least at that point in time, when it was a good government, it was something where Paul was saying, obey that government. Now let me skip to something here that Moo brought up in his book. And I got a couple questions here, but one of the things is capital punishment right or wrong? And does verse 4 have any bearing on that? Let me read verse 4 again. For it is a minister of God to you for good, but if you do what is evil, be afraid. For it does not bear the sword for nothing, for it is a minister of God, an avenger who brings wrath upon the one who practices evil. Does that have any bearing on the capital punishment debate, and does that say anything about is capital punishment right or wrong? Yeah.
I believe it's right. I don't think it's something that should be. I don't think it's something we should be excited about.
Yeah.
But I do think that the Lord has gave it to the hands of the government to decide whether they want to have it or to not institute it.
I agree with you. Well, one thing I should say is when I ask is capital punishment right or wrong, it's kind of a trick question because you kind of brought it up, but no, the first thing probably everybody should have asked is for what? You know, is capital punishment right or wrong because you ate a Twinkie? No, it's probably wrong in that case,
Right.
okay? So obviously there are four whats as far as that goes, but yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, you really mentioned what I want to say. But actually, in the Bible, remember the capital punishment that happened, Achan,
Yeah,
when his soul was stoned to death
yeah,
because of he stole something
From AI.
Exactly.
yeah, exactly.
So it depends.
There's the Old Testament, but it's still something to look at.
Yeah.
Okay? And in addition to that, something else that might have a bearing on this is the fact that, remember, Christ suffered capital punishment, and Paul had to be thinking when he's saying about, the emperor, the government as an avenger, you got to kind of look at that and say, well, he must have known there was capital punishment because did he forget about this guy named Jesus?
Mm-hmm.
That was capital, for a bad reason also, but that was capital punishment. Okay? Now, were you going to say something, I think? Or, okay, I thought I saw another hand. Yeah, go ahead.
I think fundamentally, in perfect, I have no problem with it.
Mm-hmm.
But because I also understand the society in which I live
Mm-hmm.
and the imperfections and prejudices that exist in society, it's
Yeah.
not the subject of capital punishment I have an issue with. It's that I have no faith in the government that metes it out.
And that might be a valid concern, okay? I'm not trying to deny that, yeah. So you've got some things that are theoretically one way and in practice another way. I hear what you're saying. I will say this. There are some cases when I hear certain crimes that people commit, and it makes me angry that there's no capital punishment in those states, okay?
Yeah, like the dude that kept the women in the house for 10 years.
Right.
I mean, in that
Right.
case, the dude, they know without a shadow of a doubt that he did that,
Right.
that there's no doubt in my mind.
Right.
And the fact that we have to go through a trial and spend money, to me, that's
Right.
like, okay, he needed to stop
Yeah.
breathing that day.
Stoning in the town square. I agree. And here's the thing I was going to say, though, is that when you look at that kind of stuff, yeah, I think that's a good point. But when you look at that kind of stuff, actually, that's not losing my train of thought here. Sorry, it happens when you get over 50. No, I think that's a good point. I'm not really trying to address the practical issues here because I agree there's practical issues. What I'm trying to address in this, I think Paul's kind of addressing here is it morally wrong? Now let me say this. I actually don't believe capital punishment is morally wrong. I do believe it should be unquestionable evidence. For example, you catch them in the act or something, things like that, okay? However, I don't believe it's morally wrong for capital punishment. However, to be fair, okay, this verse doesn't mention capital punishment specifically. I think it applies to it because I think it's saying the government has the right to do what it wants to do in those cases. So I think we should apply it to it. But I'm also not going to say that the Bible absolutely says the government has to do that or something else, okay? I will say this, I do believe when you're talking about pedophiles that are killing children, when you're talking about serial rapists that are killing women, when you're talking things like that, when you execute them, there is no chance of them ever committing the crime again. Okay, so that plays in my mind some as well. And again, I think what Paul's saying here is the government's there for a reason to dispense justice. Now, Can it be done improperly? Yes. And we can see in Rome, Christ should never have been crucified for what he was crucified for. I'm glad he was. But Christ is a perfect example. Should he have been put to death? Absolutely not. He certainly didn't do anything wrong. The one person who we know didn't do anything wrong, and yet he was put to death by capital punishment. So, you know, in a practical standpoint, certainly issues. Not only that, let's forget the United States for a little bit. It's a little easier to talk about capital punishment here. What about in Russia under Stalin? Like what, 20 million people were killed? What about Hitler with that was capital punishment in their eyes? Yeah, go ahead.
I think there's one thing to keep in mind is that as Paul wrote this, he himself suffered ridiculously unjust punishments already
Yeah,
in the hands of government. So he sees in all government, regardless, the sovereign hand of God. He was subjected to 39 lashes 4 different times. He was stoned to death.
yeah, you're right.
Time and time again, he himself had to submit and trust God to be the ultimate arbiter of the authority and the punishment and everything.
You know
So
what?
you have to.
Yeah, what were the dates of that? Like in Ephesians, what were the dates of that?
I don't know.
Okay, and Philippi with. Yeah.
But at the time he wrote those, I mean, you would
He
assume
probably
that some, if not
he
all, of those
certainly
had
had been
probably already been
persecuted. He certainly had been
experienced.
persecuted by others.
Well,
However, he
it
also
was all the early Christians that
Yeah.
underneath Saul were
Right.
being put to death and tortured. So I mean,
that was not again. That was not governmental, but I agree. That was a religious
they
order.
were
But
authorities that were able to mete out
Yeah.
punishment.
I understand.
Again, so
Right.
I'm just saying, take it into a context. Paul is saying that in all circumstances, submit and trust God. I mean,
Okay.
I'm not saying it's easy necessarily, but he did it.
Okay. I hear what you're saying, and there's two sides to this. We're gonna
Yeah.
It's gonna get a little stickier in a minute, though. Trust me. I promise. Okay.
Alex?
Now, in all circumstances, okay, is it unconditional? We already talked about that. We already talked about the condition of the Roman government when Paul wrote this. What if the government said you have to murder someone? What if the government said you have to be the one pulling the switch and you don't think the person's guilty?
Are you asking?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm
Didn't Paul say
going
that
to
the
original
government
question that
also-
it's between you and the Lord at that point. I'm going to say no.
Okay,
In
yeah,
all
so far.
circumstances, you're not going to do
Okay.
that as a Christian.
Well, let me ask you a question. What if you were a Nazi soldier in World War II?
I think that's more of a profession in that I wouldn't be a Nazi soldier.
I
I
understand,
wouldn't
which
use-
maybe you need to not be a Nazi soldier, but again, that's another question.
Yeah,
But
I
you
don't
started out
even
as part of the German military,
Right.
and then,
Right.
so you had already
And
enlisted.
a lot of them did, most of them did.
Right.
So you were in it already.
Right.
And you'd agreed to be part of the military machine.
Right.
Like, just like we volunteer, and you're in it.
Right.
And then it takes a turn for awful.
Right.
The question then is, what is your course of action? Do you stay? Do you desert?
Yeah.
And knowing the machine that is coming after you,
Right.
if you do that, that is.
Let me take it a step beyond that. Who can tell me who Klaus von Stauffenberg was?
Name one more time.
Klaus von Stauffenberg.
The Red Baron?
No. That was Max von Richthofen, or
Von.
Baron von Richthofen.
Right.
No, Klaus von Stauffenberg. And I want to find out if you think he was right or wrong in what he did. Okay? Klaus von Stauffenberg, I actually have known about him for years, but there's been several movies written about him. The movie most recently was called, what was it? Valkyrie, I believe it was.
Oh, yeah.
Starring an actor that I really don't like in movies, and I think
Tom
is
Cruise?
grossly overrated,
No.
Tom Cruise. The point being, though, is, does anybody remember what that movie was about?
I didn't see it. I heard of it.
Nazis, okay, but what about the Nazis? All right, I'll fill you in. Klaus von Stauffenberg was a colonel in the German army. Well respected. He had lost his arm in a battle and stuff like that, and he had become part of essentially Hitler's inner circle of not the generals who were doing the advisors, but he was able to meet with Hitler specifically and everything.
Was he the one that was going to kill Hitler? Or?
He's the one that actually planted the bomb. He's the one that had the bomb not been moved behind a heavy oak table leg, probably would have killed Hitler. He's the one who actually should had 2 bombs to plant. Had he been able to do that, it would have killed Hitler. But he was only able to get one of them planted. He's the one that probably for 6 months to a year beforehand met, prepared, talked to people, etc., with the idea being that he was going to kill Hitler. And Klaus von Stauffenberg said he was a Christian. I have no reason to doubt it or accept it either way, I don't know. But one of the reasons he did it was because of his Christian faith. I think he was a Catholic, if I remember correctly. But the point is that he felt that he had no choice, but he had an obligation to try to kill Hitler. Okay. Was that obeying the government that ruled over him?
Mhm.
Was it right or wrong?
The government was right.
Okay. But was it obeying the government that was over him? Now, I mean, sure.
Well, he
Forget about for
he
him.
put
Was
aside
it
the
really-
government. He put aside the government law for what he deemed was a higher law, which is the law of God.
Okay.
That's, you know, and I see in a situation
But he
like
wasn't
that.
just standing against it, he was actively trying to assassinate Hitler.
That's not
Right.
God.
That's what I was thinking.
Yeah.
Is it right or wrong?
Yeah.
That's
Now,
wrong.
now you're
That's
getting
wrong
to
for you.
murder.
Right for you, wrong for you. Anybody else? How many think it was right? How many think it was wrong?
Can I stand like right here?
Yeah, and that's what everybody wants to.
I think it was right that he was against it. I think it's wrong that he decided to
Murder.
assassinate.
I actually believe personally that this is probably one of the rare circumstances where it crossed over the threshold and it was right what he did. Personally, I believe that. However, I could argue it both ways. Put me in a debate, I can easily take either side, okay?
Because this guy was trying to save 6 million people. I mean,
Right, that's
he
what I'm
was
saying,
killing
yeah.
one to save millions.
And not only that, but
makes
had
perfect
he,
sense
had he
Is that a reason?
succeeded, his country might have been able to negotiate a peaceful surrender and not be destroyed and everything else. So it's more than just the people that are being killed outside, inside too.
Mm.
Now, the reason I say that is, I do believe that there are certain times when a moral law goes to the point where it's so much higher that, you know, you have to say, wait a second. However, you can contradict me on that, and you can feel free. The reason I'm bringing this up is not to settle it in your mind, but to say, look, there are some things we really got to look at here that are tough questions to answer in this thing. This isn't an easy one. And you can just as easily be on the side of saying Stauffenberg was wrong. I'm okay with that. I personally think it was okay. But, you know, where that line is, I would say this. That's probably one of those areas where I would have to say the next chapter deals with it in our conscience and acts of conscience and things like that. Okay? But, you know, it's awful easy to gloss over this and say, yeah, we obey the government, you know, ding dong, the witch is dead, and everything's fine, and abracadabra, and everything's cool. That's not the point. The point is there is a lot of stuff to dig into on this one. And not only that, let me say that we are fortunate that we live in the U.S. What if you lived in, you know, what if you were an operator, a soldier in, as I said, Stalin's Russia? How about China under Mao Zedong? You know, how about Cuba under Castro and when they were going out after people? I mean, you can go on and on and on and on. The point is that it's not so cut and dry. I do think there are times when a believer needs to stand up and actually take action, but I can see both sides of it in Scripture. And here's part of the problem is, we're looking at one letter written to one set of people for one specific purpose, and it is to glorify God. And I think we have to realize, though, there are occasions when things can be contradicted by other parts of Scripture. And it's not a contradiction, it's just saying there is another factor that weighs more here. One of the things, yeah, go ahead.
I was just saying that just reminded me of Pilate for not standing up for Jesus.
Yeah. He wasn't a believer, but I agree with you.
Yeah.
Now, something else, too, I was going to say is that in truth, we have the same issues in our court system. If something went to court, you know, let's say it goes all the way to the Supreme Court, and the basic law was, can you murder somebody because you don't like the fact that he's got red hair or not? Okay? You'd probably have 9 justices in agreement for the first time in history, or first time in a long time. They'd say, no, you can't murder somebody because he's got red hair. Okay? The problem is, almost every case you go to the Supreme Court, what you look at is you'll find 2 or 3 or 4 different rights, all of which are valid, but yet you can't possibly have all of them be true at the same time. And that's why you have to have decisions made by a court. I think you've got the same kind of thing here where in the individual life where there's certain decisions that, you know, look, there's one passage says this, the other says that. They're not contradicting each other, they're just saying they're different circumstances, and at that point you've got to make a choice of conscience. Now, the reason I bring this up is because if you say that Carleton Stauffenberg was wrong, because he was actually looking to murder somebody, okay? What about the protests of Martin Luther King? What about the Selma bus, you know, when they boycotted the Selma buses? What about Rosa Parks sitting in the front of the bus? Because frankly, that was illegal no matter how you cut it. All of it was illegal. Well, not the marches necessarily, but that was illegal. It was civil disobedience, right or wrong. Go ahead.
I was going to say that the Martin Luther King rallies and stuff were not illegal, but
Not the rallies,
but
right.
I can't justify what Rosa did because I don't, especially me as an African American, I don't think she was wrong for the way she did.
Okay.
And being an American, so I don't know.
I think she was right.
And I think she was right too.
However, let me say this. if you take the position that some of these other positions you're taking, it's very difficult for you to take the position that Rosa Parks was right.
Right.
Because she wasn't murdered. Yeah, it wasn't a murder. Now, in truth, yes, blacks were being killed in the South. Don't get me wrong, but certainly not on the scale of Hitler with your 6 million, one shot type thing. However, to me, the level of repression and everything rose up to a level where it was appropriate for her to do what she did. Okay. Now, the other thing too is the reason I bring this up is because whether it's black and white, whether it's Christians, whether it's whatever else, sometimes it's very easy for us to get into a spot where, and I'm not criticizing anyone here, but as a black, I assume it would be, I'm not a black, so you have to tell me, I assume it would be very difficult for you to stand up and say, Rosa Parks was wrong, she should have obeyed God.
It's pretty tough.
I'm guessing that'd be a pretty tough one, okay? And frankly, for me, and as a Christian, some things happen. So at first I sit back and think, wait a second. In truth, I think you're right. I think she was right. But look at the reasons in the Bible, not simply because it's a racial thing or something like that. Frankly, what she was protesting was horrible. But frankly, it's funny too, you think about it, in the old U.S., it was legal to own slaves. And it was legal to do what you wanted with them. So was the Underground Railroad wrong? Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, I don't want to.
No, go for it.
I don't want to turn this class completely in a different direction. But so, do you think that these very rare distinctions where people make moral decisions that are above the law, does that in some way come from an instinctual, almost like moral rights that everyone is given at birth?
I think part of it, yeah.
Rosa
I do.
Parks though was tired.
I'm sorry?
Rosa Parks was tired.
Yeah.
No, straight up.
No, she was. I agree.
Straight up, when it comes to Rosa
Right.
Parks, she was tired.
You're right.
And hers was just like, I'm not moving because I'm tired.
Right.
And I'm a human being, I shouldn't have to do that. And
Right.
she didn't have a great,
No, but she had a human dignity idea. And that's what I think we're coming down to here with what he's saying. And let me throw something else at you here. Because all of a sudden it's very easy for me to say, okay, everybody who's black say this or whatever, okay? I'm sorry, African American black, I'm not trying to offend anybody with terms. Every week the term's different, so I'm like, whatever, okay? My point is this. My point is, that doesn't cut too close to home on me as far as the, that. But what about George Washington? Technically, he led a rebel militia, disobeyed the laws of Great Britain, and I love this country, and George Washington was, let's face it, running around with a bunch of old white guys. Well, maybe not that old at that point in time. Were they breaking the law? Frankly, I can make an easier case for Rosa Parks and what she did, and for the other people in the South, what they did, the blacks in the South, than I can for George Washington. Now, that may sound heretical, because I think this country was a country that God led into existence. But yet, you've got to look at it also and say, well, wait a second, he disobeyed the governments. And in truth, there was no government of the United States. He formed it. Well, not he personally, but they got together and formed it. So it's not like you say, well, he's obeying his own government.
he was disobeying England.
Yeah, but that was the government here. So, I mean, the point is, what I'm saying is, that one to me, I actually think it was appropriate probably to do what he did, but that was a lot closer call for me than it is for like the Rosa Parks one. I think that one's one where, frankly, I could debate it both ways. As much as I love America, I could also see that some of the things that were done to stir up the country and stuff like that maybe weren't the most Christian things in the world, and maybe weren't following God's will in some ways. Now, what's happened since then, obviously, I believe is good for, God wanted America to be in existence, but, again, it's sometimes, I guess what I'm trying to say is, I'm giving you these situations just to say sometimes it's not nearly as clear-cut as it looks. It's easy to sit there when everything's, black and white. I don't mean color race-wise, but I mean, everything's black and white as far as right and wrong. It's easy to stand up then and say, well, that's obvious. I think we can all agree pedophiles should be punished, okay? And if anybody doesn't agree with that, we'll meet you around back afterwards. Yeah, okay. All right. We don't want anybody, okay. Point is, I think we can all agree with that. I think we can all agree that, rapists should be punished, murderers should be punished, on and on and on. But yet you get down to these Klaus von Stauffenberg situations, or Rosa Parks situations, and even George Washington situations, it's a lot tougher to find out where that line is. Which, frankly, is probably one thing also to look at is that tough line is going to play into these next chapters we're going to look at in the second half of the class also, as far as what's on the individual conscience. Let me see. I think we already addressed peaceful protest, civil disobedience. One thing I will say, that I think does make some difference also, The United States of America guarantees each individual freedom of speech and liberty to protest things. Therefore, we can actually at times protest things and say things that are illegal within the framework of the government that other people couldn't. So the point of where you're disobeying or not disobeying the government is probably different in the US than it is, you know, under Nazi Germany or under Stalinist Russia or something, because frankly, you couldn't dissent there. Here, we can actually say that we can stand up and say the government is wrong. We can say that people are wrong, etc., whatever, and it's not an illegal thing to do, so technically it's not bringing shame on us. And I actually think that makes a difference. You might have to think about it a little differently if you lived in an authoritarian regime. Oh, that didn't come out. All right, Romans 13, 8 through 10. One of the things that we see here is that love fulfills the law. Now, that may sound kind of strange in some ways, because for one thing, love and the law were obviously at odds with each other. And secondly, it's awful easy to say, well, if love fulfills the law, as long as we're being loving, can't we just do anything? It doesn't matter if it's selfish or whatever else. And anything we do pretty much gives us liberty to do whatever we want. And if you remember, that's what Paul dealt with in Romans 6, 1 and 2. Should we sin more that we have more grace and things like that? Well, one of the questions becomes then is, what do you mean that love sums up the whole law? I mean, if you look, for example, in, let's see. Oh, nothing to anyone, sorry. For he who loves his neighbor fulfills his neighbor. Well, does that mean, not only that, love does no wrong to a neighbor, love therefore is the fulfillment of the law. Does that mean as long as you're being loving to the people around you, that whatever you do is okay? Okay, you say no. Yes, okay, you say yes.
Of course.
You're both right, in a way. Why? What are we dealing with here?
I mean, you can love the people around you and still not be saved. You know, I would like.
We're talking about believers here.
Okay.
Okay, believers though. Here's what we're coming down to. If you're doing acts that appear to be loving, you're not necessarily going to be fulfilling what the law is, okay? Essentially, and also fulfilling the law, I hate to use that term, but basically, we're not doing things that are, you're gonna rob us? No.
No.
Oh, okay. Anybody on the tape has no idea what just happened. That's why it looks very exact. It's like all of a sudden it's like, okay, I give up.
That's good.
Anyway,
Edit that part off the tape.
I know. All right, no. They won't see it. You're behind the camera, so don't worry.
Right.
All right. I just looking forward. It's like, well, that's an unusual thing to see. All right. Here's what I'm going to say. We've got the laws here. You can be doing acts that appear to be loving, and still be sinning. Okay. But if you are truly loving, I know where you're saying that. If you are truly showing love, you're not going to be sinning as you're showing love. Now, part of the problem here we've got is we redefine love into ways that we put in our culture, and it doesn't match with what biblical love was. And let me ask you one thing. We talk about love. I would make the statement that if we truly love God, and if we truly care about God, we're going to be studying about who God is and what He wants us to do and things like that. Now, the reason that's important is because I know some people are like, we don't have to know anything about God, what God wants. As long as we're sincere and showing love to people around us, we're fine.
But then who defines that love?
Right. You can be sincerely wrong as well as sincerely right.
You don't get to
Exactly.
You don't get to define what love is.
And let me throw in another example at
Especially
you.
if you say you're a Christian.
Yeah, let me throw you one other example. Wouldn't it be more loving to tell people that you can be saved through anyone? Why do you have to just be saved through Jesus Christ? That sounds more loving. After all, hell? No, we don't have hell anymore. That's more loving to say that. You see what I'm getting at? Is it? Yeah, go ahead.
I think that brings up the perfect point, is that he's saying that in the perfect world, if you're fulfilling love, you're upholding the law, but we are far from perfect in this world. So he's not telling us this is anything achievable. Otherwise, we would have never needed Jesus Christ in the first place.
I think I would go beyond that. I don't think it's just a perfect world thing. Every time we're actually truly fulfilling love, we are not sinning at that point in time. Okay? Now, we don't always do that. So what he's saying is, if you are acting in love, though, you're not sinning. I think, however, what we're not doing is looking at what love really is. Love is work as well. And part of that work is actually finding out what's right and what's wrong, studying the Bible, things like that. So what I'm saying is, I think what's happening is this. It's very easy for us to say, we're just loving and we're sincere. That's not being loving. Because you're not taking the time to actually find out what God wants. Yeah, go ahead.
But to me, even if you look at the Decalogue, that is about love.
Hmm?
That first part is love for God.
Uh-huh.
The second part is love for man.
Mhm.
So really, if you're behaving with those principles
Mhm.
and you have set aside self,
Right.
if God is first,
Agreed.
like
Yeah.
if you're in that formula because He's first and you're last, and
Right.
and you're motivated by those principles,
Right.
then you're within the
Well, let me take an example. If you're stealing from somebody, you're not acting in love.
no.
Yet, honestly, it's very easy for somebody to say, I'm not going to study the Bible. I don't need to know that. I don't need to know anything about stealing. So I'm going to be free to steal because, after all, I'm going to be loving to the people. I'm going to smile and be happy and
Smile while I
nice.
steal your money.
Yeah, and I'm going to do nice things. Yeah, exactly. It sounds familiar nowadays. But anyway, the point is that I think a lot of people, what they'll do is they will appear to be loving because they think they're doing nice things, but essentially they're saying, well, forget about what God says. I'm going to do it my way and be loving. And what I'm saying is, if we're truly going to do it God's way, part of doing it God's way and being loving is learning about God. Because after all, who's the first person we're supposed to be in love with? God. So if we're in love with God, we should get to know about God. Just like I know about my wife's taste in Singapore rice noodles, okay? We should know that God's character doesn't allow stealing. Therefore, we should know. So the point is, it's not that we should be seminary professors. I don't mean that. What I am saying, though, is there are a lot of basic things we can learn about God very quickly and not sin. So as I said, because otherwise you could actually be saying, well, I'll be nice, I'll be loving, and I'll steal from them and take something to cover my expenses while I'm doing it. That's a gross example, but the point is that what stops us from that is, I would say that that's not love. Because it's not loving God, because you don't care about what God really wants when that happens. Okay? Now the reason I bring this up is, somebody go to Galatians, actually who's next on the list? Isaiah. They've all read. Go to Galatians 5, 13 and 14 if you would. And read it out loud for us, not just turn there.
13 and 14 read as, "For you were called to freedom, brothers. Only do not use your freedom as an opportunity for the flesh, but through love serve one another. For the whole law is fulfilled in one word, you shall love your neighbor as yourself."
Right. So basically he's saying you're doing the whole law, you're fulfilling it if you're loving your neighbor as yourself. Now, again, I think that is absolutely true. But I think part of that loving is knowing, oh, gee, if I put a brick between my neighbor's eyes, that's not loving because it's going to hurt my neighbor. So part of our discovery process is actually learning what God wants. You see what I'm saying? That's why I'm kind of putting that caveat on it. It's not because I do believe the whole law is summed up in love your neighbor as yourself. And if you go back to Matthew 22, you'll find love God first, love your neighbor second. Those two are the whole law by Christ. Yeah.
I think this passage or this verse in Galatians, the foundation of it is how you fulfill the whole law through loving your neighbor, is that it pleases God when you do serve your neighbors. But the only way to know that is by studying what loving God means. So I think it is all kind of like a...
And see, that's why I'm trying. Some people, I don't mean to say that knowledge is the end all, obviously not. But I do mean to say it's very easy when you talk about love to skip over the idea of knowledge and learning, when the first part of love is learn what God's character is and what pleases God or not. And when we do that, then we have the capability to truly show love to others in a godly manner instead of in our own manner. Because let's face it, if it was left up to us, how do you show love? Well, it would involve a Redskin game every Sunday. It would involve, let's face it, we all have our own ways and stuff, and yet, I'll say this, for some husbands and wives, if you said, how do you show love? Well, it's a Redskin game every Sunday, it's pizza every night, etc. There might be a couple of wives in the place that don't necessarily agree with that showing love. Why? Because we didn't take the time to learn about them. Unfortunately, my wife doesn't care if I watch a football game. She'll watch it with me sometimes. But the point is that we need to take the time first to learn what actually is a loving act toward that individual, including toward God. And the way to do that is to learn God's character. Because right and wrong is defined by God's character. Yeah.
And the interesting thing is that there's a book that I know that many married people have to read, and it's called The Love Languages. And basically,
I've read it.
It really proposes that love is not how you want to give it,
right? But
in understanding how the other person receives it,
right?
So if you don't know what they want, then you're incapable of loving them in a of giving it in a way that they can understand.
You're not being loving.
Yeah.
Because you haven't taken the time to find out what love means to that person. I happen to agree with a lot of things in that book, and I thought it was a good book. So I know exactly
Who
what
does
you're
it by?
talking
It
about.
sounds familiar.
I don't remember,
Gary
but
Chapman. Dr. Gary Chapman.
yeah, that's right, Gary Chapman. The point is that it's actually a good book. And it does show, and frankly, if you're married, it's probably a good book to read. Because you start realizing things. I mean, there were things that, I would do for my wife when we first got married, and I thought they were very loving, and realized later on, well, that's not what she's saying or seeing at all. Even at times, believe it or not, I would bring her flowers or something. Believe it or not only was it sometimes not loving, I thought it was, but even worse, it made her feel bad about things. Because what happens is sometimes I'd bring her flowers and she'd go like, he thinks he can buy me off with flowers because after all, this is what I really want. You see what I'm saying? And we had to talk about things like that. I had to learn things like that, which was not easy. So anyway, I'm glad you brought that up. That's a good point. And I think that's part of it is we need to learn God's love language to find out what God wants us to do. Probably a good way of putting it. All right. One thing I'm going to bring up on a special topic, why did Paul give all these instructions on how to live? We've really been covering that. That all of these things we're talking about, by showing love to others, by all these things that are coming up also, are to demonstrate the unity of the Jews and Gentiles and to the unity in the body of Christ, and also by the fact of we're going to glorify God through our actions. By the way, something I should mention, just a quick little sidebar here. When I talk about what we do, what believers do, etc., this book was not written to us. This book was not written to all believers of all time either, okay? We can apply it, we can learn from it and everything else, but technically it was written to a group of people who lived in Rome in 57 to 58 AD. Now for shorthand, sometimes I'll say we should do this or we should do that, but it's because we've looked at what the truths that come through from it, but you always have to be careful to remember, none of the Bible was written directly to us. It was all written to somebody else. And if we don't keep that in mind, we can end up with some strange beliefs sometime. So I think I have to bring that up because I started thinking about the number of times I've mentioned about what this means to us, what we believe, etc., etc. If we don't do the interpretation first, we're not going to get the right things out of it.
Does that mean the Bible is not for everybody?
That's not what I said. The Bible is for everybody, but it's not written to any of us. It was only written to people who have died thousands of years ago. Okay? Now, should we learn it? Yes. Should we study it? Yes. But the actual recipients of it are already dead. Or very, very old, one or the other. But I'm guessing dead. It'd have to be 2,000 years at least, so that's getting up there. All right.